What if ADHD is shaping your sex life in ways you never realized? The connection goes far beyond focus and productivity. It quietly weaves itself into intimacy, attraction, and relationships. Let's talk about ADHD and sex. How does one influence the other, and why? Core ADHD traits like inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity often spill into romantic and sexual dynamics in subtle ways that aren't obvious at first. If you have ADHD, or care about someone who does, some of what follows may feel very familiar. Today, we're unpacking how ADHD affects intimacy and relationships, because the links can be surprising. Let's break it down. 1. Hypersexuality and hyposexuality. People with ADHD often experience sexuality at the extremes. Like a pendulum, it can swing sharply in either direction. Some individuals experience hypersexuality, a strong drive for intensity, novelty, and stimulation. Research shows that people with ADHD tend to report higher levels of sexual desire and more frequent sexual activity compared to non-ADHD groups. This makes sense neurologically. Sexual stimulation triggers the release of dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, and oxytocin. Because ADHD is associated with lower baseline dopamine levels, the brain naturally seeks out rewarding, high stimulation experiences. On the other end of the spectrum is hyposexuality, a noticeable drop in sexual interest and low libido. Why does this happen? ADHD is often accompanied by chronic stress, emotional overwhelm, rejection, sensitivity, and sensory overload. Any of these can quickly shut down desire. Persistent mental overload can feel exhausting, leading some people to withdraw from sex altogether. Difficulties with emotional regulation may also make intimacy feel draining instead of energizing. So, if your desire fluctuates dramatically between high and low, that pattern is actually very common with ADHD. 2. Impulsivity and risk. Impulsivity is a hallmark symptom of ADHD. While it doesn't appear the same way in everyone, since ADHD exists on a spectrum, it can strongly influence sexual decision-making for some individuals. Studies indicate that people with ADHD, particularly when symptoms are untreated, are statistically more likely to engage in unprotected sex, pursue casual encounters, use contraception inconsistently, or enter relationships very quickly. Here's the part most people don't expect. The data confirms what many experience, but rarely talk about. ADHD doesn't just influence desire, it can shape sexual risk, satisfaction, and emotional patterns in measurable ways. In a 2024 peer-reviewed study, researchers surveyed 1,482 adults, including 561 individuals diagnosed with ADHD, using an anonymous online questionnaire. The findings showed that both men and women with ADHD reported engaging in riskier sexual behaviors compared to participants without ADHD. The risk was especially pronounced in women with ADHD, who reported earlier sexual debut, less consistent contraceptive use, a higher number of sexual partners, and more instances of infidelity compared to both ADHD men and non-ADHD participants in the study. In addition, both male and female participants with ADHD reported lower overall and sexual satisfaction, even though they were sexually active at rates similar to others. What does this suggest? Sex and relationships are already complex, but ADHD introduces additional challenges tied to impulse control, heightened emotional intensity, and dopamine-seeking patterns. This is why many professionals stress the importance of slowing down, setting clear intentions, strengthening impulse regulation, and practicing mindfulness. Hyperfocus and the fade-out. Hyperfocus in ADHD refers to an intense, sustained concentration on something highly stimulating or interesting. At times, this can escalate into hyperfixation and become unhealthy. In dating and relationships, hyperfocus can make early stages feel electrifying, passionate, euphoric, and all-consuming. Sex during this phase can feel extraordinary because novelty boosts dopamine levels. But here's the catch: Hyperfocus is temporary. As familiarity replaces novelty and routines form, dopamine stimulation decreases. Interest may drop quickly not because feelings disappear, but because the neurochemical high subsides. This shift can create confusion, emotional distance, or mismatched levels of desire between partners. For the person on the receiving end, the sudden shift from intense romance to emotional withdrawal can feel painful and bewildering. Still, ADHD does not mean relationships are destined to fail. With self-awareness, mutual understanding, and honest communication, couples can build stable and fulfilling partnerships. Inattention, sensory sensitivity, and connection. The effects of inattention and sensory processing differences are often underestimated in relationships involving ADHD. This might show up as distraction during sex, difficulty staying mentally present, or feeling overstimulated by certain types of touch. This doesn't reflect a lack of care, it reflects a nervous system that processes stimuli differently. ADHD and sexuality are more complex than they appear. A 2020 review published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine reported that adults with ADHD frequently describe higher sexual desire and more frequent sexual activity. Here's the part that often feels the most confusing. Desire can be high, yet satisfaction can still be low. Although adults with ADHD frequently report strong sexual desire, studies also show they experience lower sexual satisfaction and higher rates of sexual dysfunction compared to adults without ADHD. This disconnect between elevated desire and difficulty in fulfillment helps explain why sex and relationships can feel especially complicated. The ADHD brain constantly seeks novelty and excitement because those experiences boost dopamine levels at naturally CRAVs. But chasing that stimulation can become mentally and emotionally exhausting. That's why clear communication, consistent reassurance, and intentionally slowing the pace can make a meaningful difference. So what does all of this really mean? ADHD influences intimacy in many subtle ways, shaping desire, impulsive choices, emotional bonding, and even the pace and intensity of connection over time. None of these tendencies mean there's something wrong with you. They simply reflect a brain that functions differently. When you recognize these patterns, you can learn to navigate them instead of feeling confused or ashamed. If you have ADHD or care about someone who does, remember, these relationship dynamics aren't character flaws. They're part of your neurological wiring. Awareness is the first step toward creating deeper, more satisfying connections. With patience, open dialogue, and self-understanding, relationships don't just survive, they can truly flourish. You're not broken. Your brain is just wired differently. Did any part of this resonate with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you for being here. Have a great day.